At one time, football writers, players and managers were one big happy family.
There was a cosy relationship between football writers and people in the football business. You know, they would go drinking, wining and dining.
But then the family fell out. The manager with the journalists.
You're pushing your luck. You are stooping to low tactics.
The fans with the team. And then with each other. Before long, the journalists were having a square go with each other too.
He went ballistic and he was about to punch me.
This is the story of how the beautiful game turned ugly and how football's back pages became front page news. Only a few short decades ago, football had the air of a gentleman's club. Reporters would slip into something comfortable, pour another martini and mingle freely with players and managers. Nice.
Access to the players was relatively easy and relaxed in these days because we knew and the player knew that he would be writing about football matters.
You would phone up someone and say, look, we'd like to do a feature on so-and-so, would that be okay? I'll come along on Friday after training, and there was no question of money. Same with managers. Managers were hugely accessible in those days. We were there, we were part of it.
But it was the managers who called the shots, as one young reporter was soon to find out from Rangers boss Jock Wallace.
I've been reading a lot of stories in the Evening Times. He says about Rangers players asking for transfers. He says, no, we'll get your name on them. I said, the story's true. And he said, yeah, he said, but that's not the bloody point. And he said, I should just hit you. He says, and I thought, no. And he got off from the desk and he walked right to where I was and he smacked me across the back of the head. I thought, the manager of Rangers hitting me, you know. I thought, what happened? He said, right, I said, dealt with it. He said, are we going for a half? And we went into the blue room and he poured a couple of large whiskies and that was it, done and dusted.
Chick Young was to learn the hard way, never bite the hand that feeds you. And as for off-field shenanigans, forget it. Footballers' lives were strictly offside.
There was an unspoken law that off-parade was off-parade. Anything that happened outside the immediate football circle was not mentioned. And believe me, some hairy, scary things did happen, but you wouldn't read about it in the press.
Occasionally you would hear of a story, but your better judgment and your sense of what was right and proper would probably make you decide, no, I know that chap's got a problem with alcoholism, and I know that chap's got domestic trouble, or I know he's heading for a divorce, or I know he's been caught in a nightclub, but I'm not going to use it.
Of course I knew stories about indiscretions of players and managers, people in the game. I don't think it was my business to go and clipe.
However, something was stirring in football's gentleman's club. It was just about to be shaken up. The reason? Argentina.
It certainly scarred me for life. If you open up my heart, you'll find Argentina scars in there.
That is one example where people in our business should have been taken out 100 miles south of the Azores and torpedoed.
In 1978, Scotland was gripped by a powerful fantasy. We were going to win the World Cup. The manager said so, the team believed it, and the fans started packing their bags for South America. The newspapers gleefully stoked up the madness and hysteria.
The famous Hampden Park Stadium has witnessed many important occasions in the past. Tonight's send-off, though, for Scotland's World Cup squad was something extra special. Here was Ali's now famous tartan army of fans in full cry.
The Scots really had brought this on themselves because there had been this hysteria and frenzy beforehand.
It was an emotional night to stir Scottish pride.
Expectations were high, feeling of euphoria. It was a thrill of having qualified. The whole country was right behind it.
I think a medal of some sort will come, and I pray and hope that it's the gold one. Space is in the wardrobe for it to be put there.
What kind of intelligence are we supposed to have as a nation if we're going to start peddling fantasies like that as if they're true? I mean, it was ludicrous.
Ali MacLeod himself led the parade of 22 players onto the pitch.
He was like the grand old Duke of York. He led everybody to the top of the hill but didn't know there was a huge abyss on the other side.
And looking down into the abyss were the boys from the press. The posse had arrived in town. While Scotland prepared behind the heavily guarded gates of their training camp, the press pack lurked in bars and hotel lobbies, ready to pounce.
Before I went to Argentina, I'd been worried that, would there be sufficient stories to actually cover? I should have worried. I mean, it's a Scottish football team.
Scotland kicking off, playing from right to left.
Yep, it's a Scottish team, all right. All he had to do was sweep aside the old men of Peru.
And it's 1-0. On Scotland in a tangle, and it's 1-each. Space for the shot, he put that away so well.
But it was the Dad's Army from South America that had the last laugh.
There's the final whistle, with Scotland beaten by 3-1.
From potential champions to jokers in the pack, the teams scuttled back to their training camp. Here they would be safe from the journalists' prying eyes. Wouldn't they?
The security is absolutely first class at the moment. It's not interfering with the players in any way whatsoever.
But a 6-foot barbed wire fence and some guys with guns weren't going to stop our boys. They were going over the top, with the press boys hot on their heels.
There was some great stuff they got about the footballers climbing over the wall and going to the casino and ripping their trousers on the barbed wire.
We don't feel as if we're enclosed in and cold, shall we say. Although to the outsider trying to get in, they tell me it's slightly different, as you would find this morning.
This wall was meant to keep people out of the training camp, but it was designed in such a way that the players could climb over the wall and go to the casinos.
I mean, the players were bored. There was so little for them to do.
They had simply gone to a casino. They came to a fence, tried to climb over the fence, only to be met by a heavily armed soldier.
They were out late at night. They're out late at night. Some of them, only a few. But the local Argentinians couldn't believe it. And they were saying, our team, national team, are for World Cup. They train, they practice, they stay in the hotel, they go to bed early. Some of your players, we see them in the streets late at night, and not the way to continue like this,
Lose the bookie.
1-0 Poland.
It was a safe bet now that events off the field would start to hog the headlines. Back home, editors were itching for more front-page stories. It was time to unleash the news hounds.
I think desks thought that the relationship between the footballers and the sports writer was too close, and that sometimes the naughty stories didn't get out. So they decided to send news reporters who didn't know the players and didn't want to know the players, but would root around in the dirt and find any naughty stories going.
The sports journalists hated the news reporters being there because they felt that we shouldn't be there. That was their job. They would cover everything, and they didn't like us stirring up any dirt or stories that were there that they preferred not to be told.
And so tensions were very real, even between colleagues in the same paper.
Because you all came from the same newspaper doesn't mean you were working as a team.
There were arguments in hotel bars between two journalists from the same newspaper, the sports writer accusing the journalists of stirring up trouble.
Yeah, I almost came to blows sometimes with one of my own sports guys, and he went even angrier when he found out I'd been doing this investigation into the late night activities of, say, some of the players.
These news journalists were not there to talk about team selection or players' injuries or who scored a good goal or what the result might be against whoever. They were there hoping that there would be some sleaze and dirt and scandal that they could latch on to.
And they didn't have to wait too long.
There was a daily diet of stories, and it just seemed to get worse and worse.
The more we did to make it positive, the more things would conspire against us. We had, of course, the results, and then if we didn't have enough going against us, we had the Willie Johnston thing.
Scotland were just about to drop the biggest bombshell of the tournament. Their key striker had failed a drug test.
When did you first hear about this allegation? This afternoon. Were any drugs or stimulants taken at all? Yeah, never took anything like that in my life.
Willie seemed confused, but the test result was clear enough. Tabloid snapper Ken Lennox was first to hear the news.
We went up there and knocked on Johnson's door, and I said, "You're going to be thrown out, you're going back to Britain." And he looked at me incredulous, and he had a polo mitt which he was sucking between his lips at the time. And I took some photographs, and he thought I was joking. I said, "You failed your drug test." And of course the SFA had a press conference and said that Willie Johnson was on his way home.
The Scottish Football Association, gentlemen, has never before been involved in such a matter, and the officials concerned here in Argentina are determined that the good name of our country must be protected.
Suddenly, we, the press guys involved, found the heartbeats beginning to race. The edition time was coming up back home. It was as quick as we could get on the phone to, there was no time to compose any fancy prose. The story which I filed was the splash on the front page because it was a quite sensational story.
What did Willie do? He took over a night nurse. He was not a... he wasn't running cocaine out of Colombia. He took a little something to help him nod off at night.
Not that the press seemed to care or make any distinction. They were smacking their lips at the story and the prospect of more to come. Next up were Iran. No problems there then.
Driven in at the goal. Iran are level, and that is disaster for Scotland.
And nothing makes a better headline than a good disaster. Not that our friends in the south were shedding any tears over that.
Scotland were the only one of the home nations to qualify for Argentina, and so suddenly they had Fleet Street and the English press who had a different agenda altogether.
There would be a jealousy in Scotland's qualification that hadn't happened in other quarters, and it would be with some glee that they would take us down a peg.
Fleet Street had smelled blood, and they began circling the increasingly demoralised Scottish camp.
Strangely enough, Dennis Howland, the sports minister, was that very night holding a reception for the Scottish team.
And one reporter blagged his way in.
Trevor MacDonald obviously wanted an interview with Willie Johnson, so he called him over.
Willie, you've heard these reports.
Are you here to interview the players, or are you here to do... And Willie was just about to answer the first question from Trevor when Ali MacLeod saw the television lights and came storming over. He began an absolute tirade.
I think you're pushing your luck, but I would just rather now you leave the company. You are stooping to more tactics.
I was possibly the only witness to this, and I was taking this down as well because this was all very interesting and entertaining stuff. When I got back, my colleagues from Fleet Street, they loved it. They actually immediately jumped on it and filed stories back to London.
What are the chances now for the World Cup? What do you think? Not very good at all.
The curtain was falling on another Scottish football comedy. The final game rescued some bruised Scottish pride, but it was too little, too late.
So Scotland are out of the World Cup, and it's now certain that their manager, Ali MacLeod, will go home to Scotland with the team and then resign as the manager.
What happened in Argentina in 1978, I think, was probably a defining moment.
Was that the end of trust? Yeah, from Argentina onwards, there was a distancing between team and press.
It ushered in the era of the press officer, the organised press conferences, the limited contact with the players on the part of the media.
Suddenly, all the rules and regulations of how the media dealt with players and dealt with football teams, all that changed in Argentina, and poor Ali was maybe the first victim.
Do you really want to hurt me? Do you really want to make me cry?
The tournament might have been over, but the post-mortem was just beginning. The players queued up to tell their stories. Football and its gentlemen's club of yesteryear was closing for business. Events off the field would increasingly dominate the game and now make the headlines. But 2 years after Argentina, it wasn't the players who were making the news. It was the fans.
the worst sporting event I've ever been at in terms of violence.
One word stood out: shame.
They were kicking lumps at each other, bottles with each other, anything they could get their hands on.
And this guy, I don't know who was a fan of which team, this other bloke was just kicking lumps of him. And what I remember, the guy's eye was hanging out. I'll never forget that.
The 1980 Scottish Cup final descended into a full-scale riot as the old firm's ancient tribal hatred spilled onto the field at the end of the match.
It was an average game, but the carnage at the end, all hell broke loose. And of course I'd filed my report in the last paragraph, whatever it was, and suddenly the game didn't matter at all. I couldn't believe what I was watching.
When Celtic's captain Danny McGrain took the cup only minutes after the goal that sealed the match, the tension round the ground exploded. The violence so close to the surface of this long rivalry spilled over into the worst football riot here in living memory.
But that day belonged less to the scribblers high up in the press box than to Scottish journalism's other ground troops, its snappers.
A picture is worth 10 million words.
They were caught in the front line that afternoon, and it was their pictures that told the horrific story.
You could sense the atmosphere. You could have cut it with a knife.
The first hint that I thought something really big was going to happen was bricks started landing about 5-10 feet behind myself and all the other photographers.
And there's an invasion of Celtic supporters. They're spilling right onto the pitch.
A couple of dozen that were on the pitch to begin with. Within seconds, it became hundreds.
And here's another charge.
I took my eye off the sky for a few minutes to pack some equipment away. Because I took my eye off the skyline, a pomade bottle, half full, came from the terracing.
Eric was felled by a blow to the head with a huge big pomade bottle with a big heavy base to it. And Eric's head had fractured his skull, a depressed fracture with his skull pushed in the way.
This is now like a scene out of Apocalypse Now.
They were kicking both Eric and myself at this stage. And there's poor Eric on the floor. This guy who had been kicking lumps out of me hesitated for a moment and looked over his shoulder, and I then swung my, I think then about 800 quid's worth of camera at him, and it hit him in the back of the head and then bounced off his shoulder and he went down. I think he'll still to this day have the lens number engraved in the back of his skull.
It does seem a pity that it would require the SES to come in and sort this out.
I looked round over my shoulder and the police horses had come on and lined up.
They lined up virtually shoulder to shoulder.
And they'd started this, I would have described it as a fairly good going gallop, right down the middle of Hampden.
And they just swept right down the park with their truncheons fully extended, and they whacked every fan in sight.
And the crowd started to scatter.
And I turned round and I've got Red Rum and his pals coming straight at me as they passed me. Got the camera up and I thought this is going to be a great back shot because a fan had run right across the front of the horses and I've got this from the back. And that specific shot just summed up the whole day for me. It was all binding together. It had all the correct ingredients for a bit of a showstopper of a picture. But it was pretty scary at the time.
Alistair Devine's picture was syndicated to newspapers across the world.
Everyone knew it would be all over newspapers, television, not just in Scotland, but all over the world.
You know, you just knew that whatever headline was going to be used in any paper, whether in this country or elsewhere, it was going to be shame, or the Italian version, or the French version, or the German version.
As football was changing, the way it was reported would have to change too. For the Scottish fan in the 1980s, there was still only one paper that meant the beautiful game, the Daily Record. But two former Record reporters, Jack Irvine and Steve Sampson had jumped ship to their tabloid rival, The Sun. Their mission? To smash the record and grab their readers. It was a rumble in the tabloid jungle, with round one going to The Sun.
It was a genuine, old-fashioned, wonderful, circulation-building, ram-it-right-up-them scoop.
It was a story that would scare the pants off the record.
The sports writer's face went absolutely chalk white. We'd wiped the floor with them.
It was unfortunate the way it happened. It sort of stuck it up Celtic.
There have been big stories, but nothing comes close.
It was the defining scoop.
Mo Johnson had sold his soul and his jersey. And this is how it all happened.
It was being in the right place at the right time. Graham Souness had phoned me up and he said, I hear you're going out to Spain. And I said, yes. He said, well, I've got to go out for a week to see my kids. He said, do you fancy sort of chumming up? And we'd laze about the pool, we're just chilling out, go out for dinner each night and have a few bottles of wine.
So over sangria and chips, what exactly did Graham and Jack say to each other?
Every night Graham would say to me, and he kept asking me this night after night after night, do you think Rangers should sign a Catholic?
If the question had left Irvine in the dark, then what an office junior told him on his return to work would switch on a light.
I saw a fax in my girlfriend's house last night that had the name Morris Johnson on it. My girlfriend's father handles the insurance for Rangers, and of course the penny dropped. So I immediately phoned Souness's mobile and I said, do you remember all these conversations we had, you know, over a few bottles of Rioja about signing a Catholic to Rangers? And he went, yeah. And I said, it's Morris Johnson, isn't it? And he said, in the great Hollywood tradition, print it.
Mo, never afraid of making a fashion statement, had only 2 weeks ago worn his heart on his sleeve. His Celtic sleeve.
I'll finish my career here. I don't want to play for anybody else, so I don't want any speculation about me going anywhere else. I just want to play for Celtic, and that's fine.
But for Irvine there followed an anxious wait to protect the story from getting into the hands of his competitors. He needn't have worried.
I seem to remember phoning our London office and being told, don't take it too seriously, because it just seemed so remarkable that a guy who had effectively signed himself to Celtic for a second time should then do the U-turn and head over to the other side of the city.
The sub sitting on the desk at the Daily Record who said, look, when he received a phone call on this matter from a punter, had said, the story is untrue, and if you ask me in 10 years' time, it will still be untrue. We've heard all this before, and hung up.
That morning, the Sun ran with a world exclusive, while the Record splashed with their big story. Poor Kevin, abandoned at the seaside.
We were euphoric at the fact we had the story, but we were absolutely dumbfounded when we picked up the final editions of the Record in the morning and they hadn't gone with it. We just couldn't believe it.
We're delighted to report a major sporting story.
And even at the press conference at Ibrox that morning, the Record and the rest of the Scottish press were still in denial.
One of my sports writers, Jim Black, was there, and Jim was sitting up the back, and a lot of the opposition papers were saying to him, you know, your editor must be mad running that story. And he said he was watching the Record sports guy's face, and Souness walked into the room, and then who walked into the room but Morris Johnson? And he said the sports writer's face went absolutely chalk white.
Oh, Morris. Wow. Everybody knows who it is.
That was the real turning point. That here was this tiny staff on a newcomer, new kid in the block, and we'd wiped the floor with them. We got the story, and I think from that day on, the record kind of lost heart.
The Sun kicked off a new kind of football story not seen before in Scotland. Not so much about who was signing up in the boardroom than who was touching up in the bedroom.
We're putting excellent sports stories on page 1, which, you know, about the misdemeanours of Rangers and Celtic and Hearts and Hibs, and, you know, every player that was up to nonsense, we were virtually in the bedroom with them, you know. So we did all that kind of stuff, and it got the punters talking, and people were talking about us in pubs and supporters clubs.
They've changed the way that newspaper reporting is done. There's no doubt about that, and it'll never go back to the way it once was. But I don't think that's necessarily for the better.
Come on, just keep on
The Record had never done that kind of story. That was a godsend to us, and we get stuck right into it. So I suppose we're a kind of early version of Footballers' Wives.
I think people want to know about the football. I, for one, and thousands like me, are not particularly interested in the wives, girlfriends and various horizontal jogging activities of football players.
But scoring on and off the field is what would now sell papers, and the Record followed suit.
It's what they want. It's a customer business. If they want to read about it every day, we'd be daft not to give them it.
But the Sun wasn't the only thing that was on the rise. If football now had glamour, mass appeal and pots of money, well, so had TV. Newspapers were to find from now on that they weren't the only game in town.
What television has done is has actually taken over from newspapers in many respects. It's instant. It creates controversy.
Football has become a branch of show business. God help us if here in Scotland we ever get the situation as England did at the World Cup with the whole pack of wives and girlfriends, and I believe in some cases you're allowed to take both to the World Cup. I just think, you know, if that comes to it to be in Scotland, then we've gone down totally the wrong road.
From football trophies to trophy wives, Spice Girls to football bad boys, the game's newfound fans were just as interested in Cleanse It Like Beckham as Bend It Like Beckham.
Your mother cares now. Your granny cares. Men, women and children, they're all in it.
From now on, newspapers would have to fight harder to compete for football's newfound fans.
One of the things that papers have to do on a Monday morning and for the rest of the week is find things that the television companies don't and can't do.
As long as football survives, football writers will survive. There's a place in people's lives if they want to sit down, you hear something, see something, I think you then want to sit down and read about it as well. I think there'll always be room for newspapers.
For 30 years, newspapers have enjoyed a unique place in the hearts of the fans. They have been their voice throughout Scottish football's highs and lows. Players and press may no longer be on the same team, but if newspapers are to have a future, it will be the fans, old and new, that will have the last say when they think it's all over.